The night hung thick over Alexandria, warm and restless, as the Mediterranean murmured beyond the palace walls. Inside the royal chambers, Cleopatra prepared for a meeting that would alter the fate of empires. She was not just a queen, but a living symbol of Egypt's dying splendor, and she knew that survival now depended on more than armies or gold. It would depend on her. The palace was silent except for the sound of her footsteps on marble. Her enemies called her manipulative, her allies called her divine, but Cleopatra called herself what she had always been, a ruler, born to command. Her kingdom was fractured, her throne uncertain, her own brother waging war against her, yet in her eyes burned a calm that only power could bring. Far from Egypt's turmoil, a new power had risen. Rome, and now one of its greatest generals had entered her city. Julius Caesar had come not as a guest but as an arbiter to decide who would rule Egypt. Cleopatra understood what this meant. She had one night to make him see her, not as a petitioner, but as a partner. Under the cover of darkness, she was smuggled into Caesar's quarters, rolled inside a rug. When the guards unfurled it before him, the Roman conqueror stared, momentarily silent. Out came not a servant or a prisoner, but a queen, radiant, unflinching, and smiling with the quiet confidence of someone who understood exactly what she was doing. That single act would shift the balance of the ancient world. By dawn, Caesar had seen in her something Rome could not offer him: mystery, intelligence, and an equal who could speak of power as if it were poetry. She spoke of alliances, of trade routes, of Egypt's wealth and its ancient gods. She promised him vision. He saw in her the living spirit of a civilization older than his own. If you want to explore more of these lost nights, where power and fate entwined beneath torchlight and ambition, then subscribe to the channel and like this video. History hides its most dangerous moments behind beauty, and you will not want to miss what lies ahead. With Caesar's support, Cleopatra took back her throne. Her brother was defeated, and the Nile once again bowed to her command. Together she and Caesar sailed through the heart of Egypt, the people shouting her name, believing the gods had blessed them with two rulers instead of one. She was Isis reborn, and Caesar, her mortal consort. But in Rome her name carried a different echo. Senators whispered that she had bewitched him, that Egypt's queen had seduced their ruler and poisoned his mind. They saw her not as a monarch, but as a threat. Cleopatra ignored them. She understood something the Romans did not, that power was not taken by strength alone, but by presence. Her relationship with Caesar gave her son, Caesarion, the living embodiment of her ambitions. For the first time, Egypt had a chance to stand beside Rome as an equal, not a subject, but power built on love rarely survives the blade. When Caesar was murdered by his own senators, the world shifted once more. The news came to Cleopatra like a shadow crawling across the sea. Rome had turned on itself. The man who had loved her, who had restored her crown, was gone. Yet Cleopatra did not collapse. She waited. She watched the chaos in Rome unfold, and she planned her next move. Two new powers were rising from Caesar's ashes: Octavian, his adopted heir, and Mark Antony, his trusted general. Both sought to rule the world. Cleopatra knew that whoever she chose to stand beside could shape the fate of Egypt itself. And when she chose not with fear, but with precision. Mark Antony was everything Caesar was not: reckless, bold, passionate, a man who lived as fiercely as he fought. Cleopatra saw in him a fire that matched her own. She would not wait for Rome to come to her this time. She would go to him. When her ship sailed into the harbour of Tarsus, the world seemed to pause. The barge glimmered with gold, its sails dyed purple, its oars beating rhythm in the moonlight. Antony watched from the shore, astonished. Cleopatra, reclined on her throne, surrounded by incense and music, her eyes steady on the man who would soon be both her lover and her undoing. That night Egypt met Rome once more, not with armies, but with a feast that blended seduction and statecraft. Cleopatra knew that power begins not in battlefields, but in moments like this where words, glances and silence rewrite the future. As the feast drew to an end, she smiled again, the same calm, knowing smile that once captured Caesar's heart. The game of empires had begun anew, and Cleopatra was once again its queen. The nights that followed in Tarsus were unlike any in history. Cleopatra and Mark Antony did not simply meet, they collided. He was a general of fire, she a queen of vision, and together they forged an alliance that was part love, part calculation, and entirely destined for legend. Their conversations stretched deep into the night, beneath silks and torchlight, as music drifted from the decks below. Cleopatra spoke of Egypt's rebirth, of how Rome's hunger for land could only be matched by her own hunger for legacy. Antony listened spellbound, his pride dissolving beneath the tide of her words. He had fought countless wars, but never had he met an enemy he could not conquer, until he met her. Soon the two became inseparable. Antony followed her back to Alexandria, where celebration turned into worship. They lived not as mortals, but as gods reborn, she as Isis, he as Dionysus. The city trembled with their presence. Their love became performance, their passion a statement of power. The palace filled with laughter, feasts, and endless nights of wine. Yet beneath the joy, there was always a current of danger. Rome was watching. Octavian, cold and calculating, saw in Antony's love not romance, but weakness. He would use it to destroy them both. Cleopatra knew this. She saw the future as clearly as the Nile under the moon. But she would not bend to fear. She had built her rule on risk, and she would gamble everything again if it meant Egypt would remain free. Years passed, and their bond deepened into something larger than love. They had children together, shared thrones, and ruled as if the ancient gods themselves had chosen them. But Rome never forgave defiance. When Antony declared Caesarion, Cleopatra's son, as the rightful heir of Julius Caesar, Octavian struck. His legions moved across the seas, his propaganda filled the Senate, and his words poisoned Rome's heart. Cleopatra was painted as the Eastern Serpent, the witch who had ensnared a Roman hero. Antony was cast as her puppet, a man lost in the arms of a foreign queen. The final act began at Actium. Their fleets clashed in a storm of fire and steel. Cleopatra stood at the prow of her ship, gold gleaming in the smoke, her eyes locked on Antony's vessel. For hours the sea boiled with war. But the tide turned, and destiny, as always, demanded its due. As her fleet began to crumble, Cleopatra made the decision that would forever mark her legend. She ordered retreat. Antony, torn between love and loyalty, followed her. Rome called it betrayal, but she called it survival. She had seen enough of men who claimed glory while kingdoms burned. She would not die for a man's pride. They returned to Alexandria, the city where it all began, but the empire had already written their fate. Octavian's armies advanced, and the lovers' kingdom shrank by the hour. The feasts turned to silence, the marble halls to tombs of memory. Cleopatra knew the end had come, but she would choose her death as she had chosen her life, with dignity, with power, with her own hand. When Antony fell upon his sword, bleeding beneath the sun, Cleopatra held him in her arms. She spoke softly to him as the walls of Alexandria trembled, telling him that no empire could destroy what they had created. Love, she whispered, was the only crown that could never be stolen. After his death, Octavian entered her palace not as a conqueror, but as a man facing history's most unyielding spirit. Cleopatra stood before him draped in gold, her eyes unbroken. She offered him no tears, no surrender. He offered her mercy, but she refused it. She would not live as a Roman prize, paraded through foreign streets. She would die a queen of Egypt. The story says she took the asp, the serpent of the Nile, and let it strike her. Its venom was cold, its touch divine. Her breathing slowed, her eyes dimmed, but her face remained serene, almost smiling. When Octavian found her body, he was silent. For all his victories, he knew he had witnessed something greater than conquest, the end of a dynasty and the birth of legend. Cleopatra's death marks more than the fall of a queen. It was the death of an age, the last breath of the ancient world before Rome swallowed the earth. Her story would be rewritten by her enemies, her image reshaped by men who feared her memory. Yet even in ruin, her name refused to fade. Historians tried to paint her as a seductress, poets as a temptress, rulers as a warning. But beneath all the centuries of distortion lies a truth that endures. Cleopatra was power. Not borrowed, not given, but claimed. She bent the wills of the greatest men in history, not through magic or beauty alone, but through intellect, strategy, and absolute command of her own fate. And though Rome burned her legacy in words, the world still remembers her as she wished, not as the woman who died for love, but as the queen who made empires tremble. Her nights of power became immortal, echoing through centuries, whispered through marble halls and moonlit seas. For even now her name carries the scent of incense and the weight of crowns. If you believe history's most powerful women deserve to be remembered not as myths, but as rulers who shaped the course of the world, then subscribe to the channel and like this video. Each story we tell reclaims a piece of forgotten truth, shining light on the brilliance that history tried to bury. Because Cleopatra's story is not just one of love and death, it is the story of power itself, born in silence, burning in the dark, and remembered forever.